Joining the brace. A long stretch of summer rain brought an enormous amount of water. The reservoir was so high that the reeds were almost completely submerged. These were difficult days for Sprout. It was hard to find a dry place, and because her feathers were always damp, she suffered from a continuous cold. She had become very thin because they changed nests every day and she didn't sleep well at night. Still, Baby was growing and looking quite duckish, a little more like Straggler every day. That pleased and amazed Sprout to no end. Baby wasn't fitting for an adolescent duck, so she named him Greentop after his coloring. But she still liked to call him Baby, as that made her feel closer to him. When the rains passed, Sprout finally fought off the cold that had plagued her. But it seemed unlikely that her scrawny body would ever be plump again. She was getting old. Of course she was. Her baby was almost fully grown. Yet she was stronger than ever. Her calm eyes could detect the slightest movement in the darkness. Her beak was hard and her claws were sharp. Sprout and Greentop never spent more than 2 nights in one spot. Sometimes, from a distance, they saw the weasel returning home empty-jawed. Life as a wanderer was difficult, but it wasn't too bad. It did break Sprout's heart to see Greentop with a brooding expression on his face. He had become moody from time to time after the leader had visited them in the reeds. These episodes recurred more frequently after his feathers changed color. Sprout asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't confide in her. There wouldn't be rain again for a while. The stars twinkled at twilight, and Sprout's feathers remained dry overnight. With the nicer weather, Sprout and Greentop could find a place to sleep close to the water, but Sprout led Greentop up the slope to stay away from the weasel. She checked under the rock at the edge of the hill. They had slept in that small cave a few times during the rains, but Greentop didn't like it there because it was far from the reservoir.
We haven't seen the hunter in 2 days. I'm sure we'll see him today. I bet he'll go around the reed fields to try to get at least a warbler,
Sprout said, but Greentop wasn't listening. Deep in thought again, he was standing in a field of white daisy fleabane and looking down at the reservoir. He was just like his father. Sprout curled up in the cave and watched Greentop. He was no longer a baby. Even when she imagined talking to the mallard about what was going on with Greentop, she couldn't come up with a good solution. She was afraid the weasel would snatch Greentop like he did Straggler. It was dangerous when you let down your guard. She decided to call Greentop inside. Stepping out of the cave, she glimpsed a dark shadow slip down from a rock. It sounded like the wind, but it wasn't. Sprout stopped breathing. It was the weasel. How had she made this mistake? She had chosen the wrong spot. Until now, they had managed to avoid the weasel, but he was one step ahead of them. Greentop wasn't paying any attention. Sprout had to take charge of the situation. She was his mother. She couldn't let this happen. Drawing in a deep breath, she sprinted out of the cave like lightning, clucking and flapping her wings, shouting, "Get lost!" The weasel spun around. Greentop, taken by surprise, flapped his wings and screamed. Flustered, the weasel looked back at Greentop before turning to face Sprout. He looked bigger and swifter than before, but Sprout knew she couldn't back down. Greentop kept flapping his wings in fright. Sprout tensed her claws and raised all her feathers on end. Her eyes met the weasel's.
"Don't you dare,"
she threatened, prepared to die. The weasel slowly shook his head, his eyes still trained on her. "Don't you interfere." His voice gave Sprout the chills. The weasel wanted only Greentop, and so he wasn't wary of her. Sprout glared at the weasel.
"Leave my baby alone."
The weasel laughed derisively. Sprout felt her heart pound and her entire body inflame with rage. She was no longer frightened by the weasel's stare. As the weasel was about to turn away, Sprout sprinted toward him like a moth darting toward a flame. She pecked viciously. The weasel screamed and sprang toward Greentop. Sprout, her beak firmly clamped on the weasel, was dragged along. She could hear Greentop making a racket. Sprout and the weasel became one and rolled down the slope. The writhing weasel clawed at Sprout's belly. Only when they hit a rock mid-slope did they become untangled. Sprout began to lose consciousness.
Run away, baby,
she coughed out. A moment later, she opened her eyes. She couldn't see or move. Something was in her mouth. When she spat it out, she realized it was a piece of flesh, the weasel's flesh.
Baby, baby!
Sprout looked around. It was too quiet. Had the weasel gotten him? Was Greentop already dead? Tears sprang to her eyes. If Greentop was no longer, it would be harder to bear than her aching wounds. That awful beast.
He should have taken me. Baby's too young to go.
Sprout closed her eyes. She was drained of energy, like the time she had been tossed into the hole of death. Mom, get up! Sprout felt a breeze overhead. She blinked. Greentop was hovering in the air, flapping his wings. He was struggling to stay aloft, but he was definitely flying.
My goodness, what happened to your wings?
Isn't it amazing? I just needed to get away, and then I floated up. I can fly! Greentop shouted with elation. Sprout couldn't speak. She just smiled. It was a miracle. The third she'd witnessed since leaving the coop and hatching baby. This was the cherry on top. Mom, let me see. Are you in pain? Greentop spread his wings and embraced her. Sprout's throat closed up in gratitude. She set her beak firmly to hold back her tears, but that day it was impossible. As summer waned, a dry wind began to blow. The sun's strong rays streamed from above, and the reed flowers began to wilt. This was a lonely time for Sprout. Greentop, caught up in the joys of flying, spent entire days at the reservoir. Sprout would walk along the reed fields or go up the slope to watch him swim and fly. The weasel didn't show himself. Perhaps he was back to peering into the chicken coops for chicks or hunting chickens on the brink of expiration in the hole of death, as he would have done all along. It was silly to salivate over Greentop. How could he think snatching a flying wild duck from the sky would be as easy as nabbing a fledgling in the yard? Greentop loved flying. Not only did he stop worrying about the weasel, but he could also go from one end of the reservoir to the other in an instant. And he could coast above the reed fields to pick out a good sleeping place. His world expanded from the ground and water to the sky. While Sprout envied Greentop, she missed him. He was her baby, but he was also a wild duck.
We chickens gave up on our wings. How is it that we are proud only of the fact that we are members of the comb? Combs are useless against hunters.
Greentop was lonely like his mother. His mother was a hen, and yet he couldn't cluck. The barnyard ducks looked down on him. They refused to come near him or even acknowledge him. At the very least, Sprout and Greentop's nights were nice. Two lonely beings away from their kind, falling asleep pressed together. Sprout ate the fish Greentop brought every night and thought about the mallard, especially when her baby's sleek feathers glistened in the moonlight.
Baby,
She said one night,
even when you're sleeping, always keep your ears open. The hunter comes under cover of night. He will come at some point. He never gives up.
Don't worry about me. I'm worried about you, Mom. You can't fly or swim.
I'm fine. He isn't interested in me. I'm so lean he sees nothing appetizing about me.
Sprout joked, touched that Greentop was concerned about her. Greentop was silent for a moment. Mom, I've been thinking, he said with difficulty. He was quiet again for a while. Sprout grew nervous. How about we go back to the barn? I don't like being by myself all the time. Sprout's heart sank. This was the first time he'd said something like that. He must have been wrestling with these feelings for a long time.
Back to the barn?
I'm a duck anyway. All I can do is quack.
So what? Even though we look different, we cherish each other. I love you so much.
Sprout parroted what the mallard had told her a long time ago. She'd understood the mallard, so she hoped Greentop would understand her. But Greentop shook his head. I don't know, Mom. What if the ducks never accept me? I want to be one of them. He started to weep. Sprout didn't know what to do. She rubbed his back.
Baby, we've been fine so far. You're so smart. You learned how to swim and fly all on your own.
Sprout knew her words didn't help. Maybe she'd overreacted to the farmer's conversation with his wife. If his wings had been clipped, Greentop would have been one of the ducks. Perhaps she should have sent him along with the other ducks when the leader asked her to give him up. I know you love me, but we're still not the same kind, Greentop said.
Right. We look different, but I'm so happy to have you. No matter what anyone says, you're still my baby,
Sprout said, feeling sad. Greentop moved away. Mom, we need to go back. I'm going to join the brace.
Then I'll be headed for the chicken coop.
Sprout's heart sank. She didn't have the heart to scold him. Long ago, when Greentop fearlessly skipped across the lily pads and swam, Sprout realized he wasn't her kind.
Baby, I was a hen who had to lay eggs in a coop,
she said gently, trying to dissuade him.
I've never been able to hatch my own egg, even though all I wanted to do was to sit on an egg and see the birth of a chick. When I couldn't lay any more eggs, I was taken out of the coop. I was fated to die, but when I met you, I finally became a mother.
Greentop buried his head under his wing and didn't move. The soft moonlight glimmered on the water.
Baby, we don't have any reason to return to the barn. I'm not wanted there, and you're much better than any of those animals.
Sprout stroked Greentop's back. Greentop didn't open his eyes or raise his head, although he heard everything she said. He had grown too big for her to embrace. Even if she spread out her wings, her baby had grown up too fast. Sprout was restless all night. She didn't know what to do. She was useless now, even as a protector, since the weasel didn't come looking for them anymore. And even if he did, Greentop was strong enough to flee on his own. At dawn, when Greentop left for the reservoir, she didn't raise her head. She was afraid he would insist on joining the brace of ducks. From the slope, she watched him sidling up to them. They were cold to him. They yelled at him. The leader even attacked him. But Greentop kept hanging around. As the sun set, the ducks returned to the yard. Greentop trailed them. It was like watching the lonely mallard all over again.
Baby, come back,
Sprout called, but nobody looked her way.
You'll be lonely in the yard. You're so special. The yard animals won't accept you.
She followed him from a distance. Travelers from another world. Sprout settled in the hills where she could see the yard. Nothing had changed. The faint light that seeped out of the chicken coop where the hens clucked loudly, the wheelbarrow of feed, the animals in the barn. Actually, there was one thing new, a cockerel. He was the one young chicken who had managed to avoid the weasel. Sprout couldn't see what was going on inside the barn, but she could guess. The ducks would be arguing about Greentop. Since the leader of the ducks didn't seem too thrilled to welcome him into the brace, Greentop might be chased away. Sprout thought that might be for the best. She wanted to take him back to the reservoir. Even if he was alone, at least he wouldn't be humiliated, and he would be able to fly freely. The night passed. Greentop wasn't kicked out. The brace of ducks stuck their heads in the trough to eat, and Greentop ate from a smaller bucket. The farmer's wife had arranged that for him. It was clear she wanted him there. Anyone would, with his glistening feathers and beautiful form. If she wanted him, the rooster and the leader of the ducks would be forced to let him live in the barn. The ducks went off for a walk, with the leader at the head and the young ones trailing behind. When Greentop went to follow the young ducks, the farmer's wife grabbed him. He quacked in fright and flapped his wings. Sprout sprang to her feet. The ducks ignored the ruckus and continued on toward the reservoir. The farmer's wife tied Greentop to one of the wooden stilts elevating the chicken coop. He tried to escape, but couldn't. He burst into tears, as did Sprout. No matter how hard he flapped his wings, he couldn't free himself from the cord. Sprout should have told him why they'd left the yard in the first place. Then he wouldn't have gone back. She couldn't sit still. Struggling to free himself, Greentop refused all food. The rooster family strolled into the garden, and the dog snoozed. In the evening, the ducks returned, and everyone went into the barn to sleep. Sprout hung around the perimeter of the yard. She wanted to go up to Greentop and stroke his back. "Still alive? You're a tenacious one," the dog growled through his bared teeth. Sprout glared at him fiercely.
You think I survived out of luck? I've experienced it all. You better not bother me.
Ha! So confident. Well, you did raise a duckling, but don't even think about coming into the yard. I'm a strict gatekeeper, so I have the habit of fighting first.
He sauntered back into his house. From under the acacia tree, Sprout called to Greentop.
Baby, Mom's here. Don't cry. We'll figure something out.
Mom, don't leave me. My leg, it hurts.
Her nerves on edge, Sprout paced around. The farmer and his wife hadn't tied up Straggler, so why baby? Still pacing, she approached the hole of death without realizing it. Sprout sensed something insidious. In the darkness, something glared at her. The weasel. But he had only one glinting eye. Sprout puffed out her neck feathers and tensed her claws. Her blood boiling, she was ready to go on the offensive. The weasel had a dying chicken between his jaws. Sprout could detect the twitching of a wing. The weasel approached her slowly, and she didn't retreat. He wouldn't get her while he had dinner in his jaws. He set the chicken down, but didn't crouch to attack. Sprout puffed out her chest and glared at him.
Delectable duck, the weasel sneered. I'll get him before long.
He laughed menacingly.
You'll never get him.
No, even though he's tied to that stilt. Soon he'll be so fat he won't be able to fly. That's how they get tame.
Again, the weasel laughed. Sprout suddenly understood. Straggler wasn't tied down because his wing was damaged. He couldn't fly away.
And you, the weasel hissed, you blinded me in one eye. I'll get back at you, both of you, soon enough.
Sprout was astonished. That piece of flesh in her mouth had been the weasel's eye.
I'd rather drown in the reservoir than let you devour me,
she shot back.
Don't do that. I don't like eating dead chickens. Stay alive and just watch what I do to your baby.
The weasel laughed yet again. He grabbed his chicken and disappeared into the darkness. Sprout stared after him. She had goosebumps and was trembling. The weasel had put a curse on her. She shook her head to clear it and left the hole of death. She couldn't forget his words. Would he come into the yard even with the gatekeeper there? The dog would go crazy, and so would the other animals.
He's going to attack my baby.
But Greentop was tied up. The weasel couldn't possibly snatch him away.
He'll bide his time until Greentop is too plump to fly, and wait for the farmer's wife to untie the knots.
The next day, the weasel sauntered into view and went directly to the hole of death, but he returned empty-jawed. He crept toward the yard where the cockerel was digging in the compost pile. The weasel knew Sprout was watching from the hill. Tauntingly, he turned toward her. Sprout was frozen in place. She wanted to yell and warn the cockerel, but nothing came out. The dog didn't sense anything. His nose and ears must have become dulled with age. Sprout was sure the weasel was trying to intimidate her. Suddenly, Greentop started to holler. With his good hearing, he had sensed danger before anyone else. Everything happened all at once. The dog barked in the same instant. The weasel shot forward like an arrow, and the cockerel shrieked. Barking furiously, the dog chased the dark shadow, and the animals scurried out of the barn. The farmer and his wife came out at last. The cockerel was nowhere to be found. The rooster couple clucked and clucked, looking everywhere for their baby. Quacking with alarm, the ducks joined the chorus. "That damn weasel," said the farmer. His wife, who was trying to herd the ducks back into the barn, answered,
We need a bulldog. That dog's too old. Otherwise, the native chicken seed will dry up.
The weasel came because you tied up that duck,
snapped the farmer.
It's like inviting him to a dinner party. Go tie it up to the barn.
Sprout paced nervously as she watched the farmer's wife untie the cord, then drag Greentop, quacking and squirming, into the barn by his foot. Sprout couldn't keep an eye on him if he was tied up inside. She wouldn't be able to forgive herself.
Let go of my baby,
Sprout clucked as she barreled toward her. The farmer's wife was astonished at the sight of a hen flapping at her like a fighting cock's. Sprout's feathers stood on end as she pecked at the farmer's wife.
Ow, ow, this damn chicken's going to kill me,
the farmer's wife hollered. All the ducks came out of the barn quacking. Another huge ruckus ensued. In trying to shoo away Sprout, the farmer's wife lost her grip on Greentop.
Fly away, baby, fly away,
Sprout shouted, and Greentop lifted off powerfully. With the cord still dangling from his leg, he disappeared behind the hill. The other ducks stared in awe. Sprout ran off, just cheating death as the farmer's wife swung a broom at her. The path to the reservoir was long and dark, but Sprout had nothing to fear. In fact, she was so delighted she couldn't help humming. The poor cockerel had filled the weasel's belly, and Greentop would no longer want to stay in the yard. He'd learned a valuable lesson.
Just because you're the same kind doesn't mean you're all one happy family. The important thing is to understand each other. That's love.
Sprout ran on, elated, bursting into song. Sprout was thinner than ever. She ate only to stave off hunger, and spent all her time running around looking for Greentop, so she'd gotten as small as a reed warbler. After escaping the yard, Greentop chose to nest alone. He didn't come back to Sprout, not even at night. He stayed at the reservoir. Sprout was able to see him from afar, but she didn't know where he was sleeping. She missed falling asleep nestled against him and talking to him, but there was nothing she could do about the situation. She knew it was hard for him to accept that they were not the same kind, but Sprout wanted to help him get rid of the cord tied to his foot. It trailed him wherever he went, and he looked downcast, as though it was sorrow that trailed him. Greentop didn't want Sprout near him, but Sprout made her bed where she could see him. Although the weasel lurked now and then, Greentop had excellent hearing, as did Sprout, so they always knew when he was near. Autumn passed slowly. In the reed fields, Sprout began to spot dragonflies who had laid eggs on the water plants in what would be their final flight. After they landed, their wings stiffened, and their many eyes gazed up at the blue sky. Their eyes still moved, but they didn't harbor fear when Sprout approached to eat them. She didn't particularly enjoy eating these large-eyed, slender dragonflies, so she helped herself only when famished. The sun began to set earlier, causing the ducks to return from the reservoir sooner, leaving only the sound of the wind and the dry rustling of grass to echo in the fields. Greentop swam until late, then dragged his long cord into the reed fields. Sprout slowly followed him as the cold autumn night settled in. One early morning, the wind blew mightily, shaking the reed fields. Something was in the air. Sprout trembled as the wind cut into her feathers. She became worried about Greentop, who was within shouting distance.
Baby, are you okay?
Greentop was looking around nervously, his neck outstretched. He suddenly shouted, "Mom, be careful!" and flew into the air. Sprout tensed up. Greentop signaled that the weasel was near, then circled the reed fields, making a ruckus. "There are 3. Wait, there's another. Why are there so many?" Sprout panicked. One was enough to deal with, but now there were 4. She cautiously emerged from the reed fields. Out of nowhere, the one-eyed weasel appeared. He snorted at her. Sprout glared back. "You're not what we're looking for, unless there's nothing else to eat in the fields," the weasel said with a mischievous smile. He turned around. Sprout snapped back.
Only an excellent hunter can catch him. For a one-eyed hunter like you, it's got to be hard enough just to keep him in view. You came with 3 others, but look, he's up in the air. Or maybe you haven't spotted him yet because you're missing an eye."
Annoyed, the weasel crouched and bared his teeth, but he didn't attack. "It's hunting season. Finally, we've been waiting for this." And off he ran. Sprout looked around. It was overcast. Each time a gust of wind blew, the reeds collapsed and then wearily staggered up. The rough wind that felled the reeds left a large footprint. Something extraordinary was about to occur. Greentop called to Sprout, and Sprout called back. Having completed a loop around the reservoir, he landed next to her. For the first time in a long while, they stood side by side and looked down at the reservoir together. "Mom, it's strange. I've never felt like this before. Something is about to happen."
Hunters?
"No, not that.
Is it something more frightening?"
Mom, this is different. It's covering the entire sky. Can't you feel it?"
"Baby, what are you talking about?"
Sprout couldn't tell what Greentop was seeing through his squinted eyes or what he was hearing. "Wow, that sound. Mom, it's amazing. So many of them are flocking this way." She couldn't tell what was about to happen, but she knew it was going to be entirely new. As she waited, she started to feel it. The noise reverberated between the sky and the mountains far away. It gradually expanded, getting louder, and finally black spots appeared. They were birds, countless birds that soon covered the sky. The entire world filled with birds, and Sprout couldn't hear anything else. The birds circled the reservoir and started landing on the water. Sprout and Greentop gaped at the travelers from another world.
"Straggler, your family is here.
Sprout whispered. They had to be his kind, the family he'd missed every time he struggled to climb the hill to look far off in the distance. He'd been separated from such a big flock. How lonely he must have been without them. Mom, why is my heart pounding so hard? Greentop buried his head in Sprout's wing, like he'd done as a baby. He was trembling, inexplicably moved.
Of course it is. You've never seen such a beautiful flock.
Sprout felt at peace. She smiled.
Ah, old friend, now I understand everything,
She thought. She'd thought she'd understood when Straggler had told her to go to the reservoir with the baby, but she hadn't. He'd wanted Greentop to grow up and fly away, following his own kind. Sprout opened her wings and held her grown baby close. She embraced him for a long time. Feeling his silky feathers and taking in his scent, she stroked his back. This might be the last time. Precious moments did not remain forever. Sprout wanted to sear all this into her memory. Memories would soon be all she had. The bone-weary, one-eyed hunter. Straggler was right. The one-eyed weasel was larger and faster than the other weasels. He was meticulous and swift, sometimes teaming up with another weasel for the hunt. The weasels hung around the reservoir, biding their time. They were targeting the mallard ducks. They snatched young ducks separated from the flock, or those who'd come on their maiden voyage. The mallard ducks slept in a cluster in the reed fields and swam in a group. When the leader flew up, they all followed, creating an awe-inspiring din. The quiet reservoir had awakened. Greentop left Sprout to join them, but they weren't interested in him. Having grown up in the fields, he didn't have to worry about smelling like a domestic duck, but the cord around his foot gave the impression that he had run away from a human, so the wild ducks were wary of him. Sprout didn't leave the slope. She was safe there. The weasels targeted only the mallard ducks, and the slope was the best place from which to look down on the reed fields. Greentop tried very hard to be accepted, even though the mallard ducks didn't give him a passing glance. He tagged along and slept with them. He didn't mind making his bed at the far edge of the group where it was most dangerous. It was difficult to have to watch Greentop sitting apart from the flock or swimming alone, but there was nothing Sprout could do to help him. To her, he had always been special, especially compared to the domestic ducks. But he couldn't fly as well as the mallards. He was slower and didn't have their stamina. The cord was to blame. Sprout wished she could cut it off. She spent her days searching for stray grains in the straw piles of the rice paddies, and in the evening she returned to the cave on the slope. The cave under the rock was cozy, insulating her from the frost. From there, she tracked the weasels as they roamed the reed fields. She could tell those rascals were up to no good. By the time autumn turned to winter, the weasels had eaten all the young and weak mallards. Now, after the first snow, their hunts were less successful. Healthy mallards were formidable opponents. The hungry weasels were swift on their tails, but they were lucky to get one every other day. If they managed to catch one, they growled and snapped at one another, fighting for a larger share. Two of them left for better hunting grounds, but the one-eyed weasel remained with a friend. Sprout was concerned about Greentop, since he slept at the edge of the group. In a hunt, Greentop would be the first attacked, and he'd be dragged down by that cumbersome cord around his foot.
Baby, sleep lightly tonight. They've been hungry for 2 days,
She thought. Standing on the slope, Sprout watched the weasels as they hid in a pile of fallen reeds. The mallards were still swimming. Snow began to fall, and Sprout paced. Flakes piled on the reed fields and the dry grass where the weasels were hiding. One by one, the mallards emerged to groom themselves. At the leader's signal, they all flew up, circled the reservoir, and flew over the hill. They sometimes found a good spot over there, but more often they returned to the reed fields. Sprout squinted, trying to make out Greentop. In the snow, she couldn't see the hanging cord, and without it, even Sprout couldn't recognize her baby. She knew he would keep his ears open. He was well versed in how the hunters operated, but she was still anxious. Sprout settled in her cave. She hoped the flock would choose to sleep elsewhere, in the straw piles of the rice paddies or the thickets in the hills. She hadn't eaten because she was too busy monitoring the weasels, but she was okay. She was used to eating very little or nothing at all. It suited her, if not her weight in feathers. The snowfall turned heavy. A snowdrift piled up at the entrance to the cave and blocked her sight, but she could still hear everything. The weasels were half crazed from hunger. She remembered how Straggler would stay up all night dancing and shouting. He'd done everything he could to protect the egg.
I'm his mother. I can't sit back and let him get caught.
Sprout pushed through the snow and stepped outside. The flock of mallard ducks was returning. They must have decided to bed down in the reed fields again. They would find a spot with thick reeds to escape the snow, but the weasels were already hiding there. After circling the gray sky, they would settle into their sleeping spots. Sprout had to hurry. She ran down the slope, but snow poured down on her, forcing her to close her eyes. When she opened them, Greentop was standing in front of her. His strong wings had scattered the snow over her.
Baby!
She was thrilled. She opened her wings in greeting. Greentop looked tired and sad. Suddenly a ruckus started up in the reed fields, and the brace rose up at once. Greentop ran to the edge of the slope. A hunt! Sprout and Greentop listened attentively to the brief scream that pierced the darkness. The weasels would be full tonight. A sacrificed life meant a peaceful night for the group. Sprout was grateful that Greentop was safe. Greentop leaned his head against Sprout.
I can't stand it. I just want to live with you, Mom. Other ducks my age sleep in the inner circle, surrounded by the adults. But I have to sleep on the outside, farther out than the lookout. When we fly, I don't know where I'm supposed to be. When I'm next to an adult, I'm scolded for being rude. And if I'm behind them, they make fun of me. I'm always a loner, wherever I am. Why do I have to live like this? I'm done. I'm happiest when I'm with you, Mom. That's why I came back.
Judging from his thin body, Greentop had clearly had a difficult time with the mallards, but his wings could now create wind. He really was a wild duck now. Tired, Greentop went inside the cave, dragging the long cord behind him. His footprints and the line from the cord were stamped in the snow. Sleep well, Sprout whispered as her baby curled up in a ball. The snow piled up and blocked the entrance to the cave once more, making it warm inside. Greentop started to snore, but Sprout couldn't sleep. Tonight she had to rid him of the cord. All night she pecked at it. By the time morning came around, she was dizzy, and her beak was so sore she couldn't even open it. But the cord was now ragged. It could easily snap off. Greentop woke up, his eyes welled at the sight of the frayed cord. He grabbed one end with his bill, and Sprout grabbed the other. They each pulled, and the cord finally ripped apart. Because Sprout wasn't able to undo the knot, a piece of the cord remained, like a ring around his foot. But Greentop didn't find it bothersome. Exhausted and sore, Sprout lay down. Greentop lingered quietly before clearing the snow from the entrance to the cave and going outside. As she fell asleep, Sprout watched him fly away. Some time passed.
Mom, wake up.
Greentop said, shaking Sprout awake. Sprout pried her eyes open. Greentop had brought her a delectable fish. His eyes widened as he said,
Do you know who the victims were? 2 of them. One was the guide who looks for places to sleep, and the other was the lookout.
the weasels must have attacked in desperation, pouncing on those who landed first rather than waiting for a better opportunity. Sprout ate the fish. If it hadn't been for Greentop, she wouldn't have been able to enjoy such a wonderful meal in the middle of winter.
Thank you, baby. It was delicious.
Greentop grinned. Sprout smiled, but she felt sad.
I'm so glad I was able to free you of that cord, but I can't do anything about the ring around your foot. Let's just leave it as a marker that you are my baby, so that I can recognize you among the travelers.
Mom, do you want me to leave?
Sprout looked into Greentop's eyes and nodded.
You should leave. Don't you think you should follow your kind and see other worlds? If I could fly, I would never stay here. I don't know how I could live without you, but you should leave. Go become the lookout. Nobody has better hearing than you.
I won't leave.
Greentop said tearfully, burying his head in Sprout's wing.
Do what you want to do. Ask yourself what that is.
You'll be by yourself, and you can't go back to the barnyard.
I'll be fine. I have many good memories to keep me company.
Greentop cried quietly, and Sprout stroked his back. She wanted to tell him to try harder to be accepted by the brace, but she couldn't talk through the lump in her throat.
They might change the sleeping spot because of the hunters. I heard they may go to the mountains on the other side of the water, but then I may not be able to see you for a long time.
Greentop mumbled. Sprout listened quietly. She knew he would join them, and she was proud of him. Still, knowing that his heart had never completely left the brace, she felt empty. It was difficult to remain on her feet.
You and I look different, Mom, but I love you regardless,
Greentop said, then rushed out of the cave. Sprout stood still, unable to move. Greentop looked back. She hurried after him, but he was already flying. He circled the cave once and then headed to the reservoir. Sprout stood on the slope, watching him return to his kind. She felt like a mere shell of herself. Winter was nearing its end. In the shade, snow remained unmelted, but in sunny spots, mugwort and daisy fleabane were starting to surface. Sprout was thrilled to taste the new greens, even though they were slightly frozen. She spent the remainder of winter on the move. The weasel had become even more desperate from hunger. She moved from the reed fields to the cave, from under a fallen tree to the straw piles of the rice paddy, and then to a rotten rowboat, taking care not to cross paths with the weasel. Her favorite spot was the straw pile housing bugs that could fill her belly, but she couldn't stay long, since many field mice and fleas lived there as well. After the old dog was sold and a bulldog was stationed by the coop as the new gatekeeper, the weasel's hunger became particularly acute. As the number of prey declined, the other weasel left, but not the one-eyed one. Even after they lost the guide and the lookout, the mallards continued to make their bed in the reed fields. For the weasels stalking through the snow-covered fields, mallard ducks were a rich source of protein he couldn't give up. The lookout was the one duck the weasel had a chance of catching. So Greentop remained the weasel's target. He was now a respected lookout, with his thundering voice, glistening coat, and powerful wings. Nobody shunned him anymore. When the mallard ducks settled away from the reservoir at night, the weasel hunted for Sprout. Despite the lack of feathers and fat on her body, she was the best catch in the fields. But the weasel kept missing her. For some reason, he had slowed down. The wind turned warmer. The ice on the reservoir melted, and the mallard duck swam with vigor. Sprout ambled along the edge of the reservoir to watch Greentop from close up. The barnyard ducks came out for their first spring swim. They hadn't been able to swim all winter, so they jumped in clamorously as soon as they reached the water. The leader greeted Sprout with sympathy.
You must have had a difficult winter. You've lost too much weight.
Sprout just smiled. She wasn't all that envious of the ducks, who had grown fat in the barn over the winter.
But you look good,
The leader said in a generous spirit.
What I mean is, your appearance isn't too good, but something.
He shrugged.
You seem different from our hen. It's odd. You're more confident, more graceful, even though you're missing some feathers.
Sprout took that as a compliment. Grooming his feathers before entering the water, the leader asked,
Where's the duckling? Did he...
He was asking if Greentop had died. Sprout pointed as Greentop took flight powerfully. Surprised, the leader squinted to watch. He gave a little bow of respect. Pleased, Sprout meandered away from the reed fields. As she passed a small weeping willow, Sprout heard strange noises coming from the dry grass around it. She listened carefully. They were the cries of babies, weak but frantic. Sprout pushed her face into the dry grass. It was dark and she couldn't see anything. When her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, she realized she was in a small cave. Tiny young babies were squirming, their bodies pressed against one another, not yet able to open their eyes. Who were they? Whose were they? Sprout's heart pounded. They were four-legged babies. Sprout turned around and left. It wouldn't do her any good if she were suspected of doing something to them, but she was curious. Where was their mother? These babies were too young to open their eyes. Wouldn't they die without her? Sprout climbed the slope and waited to see if she could catch a glimpse of the mother heading to the cave, but nobody came. It was late. The barnyard ducks left the reservoir, and the mallards flew up, but no mother headed for the babies. Sprout was worried. Was the mother dead? Then who would raise the babies? Sprout came to her senses when the mallards returned from flying over the mountain. They were flying close for once, and so Sprout looked out at the reed fields, hoping to spot Greentop. What she noticed was the weasel. He was hiding in the thicket, just like the day he had snatched the guide and the lookout. Sprout tensed up. Greentop was in danger. It had been a while since she'd last seen the weasel. If he'd gone hungry the entire time, he'd be desperate. The mallards circled the reservoir. Sprout didn't have time to waste. She sprinted down the slope, flapping her wings. If only she could fly instead of having to depend on her stubby legs to run along the ground. These useless, useless wings.
You awful creature!
Sprout shouted at the weasel as she started to tumble down the slope. Dry grass and trees clawed at her mercilessly, but she didn't feel a thing. Her only thought was to get to the reed fields before Greentop landed.
Look here! Here I come!
She bellowed. She must have looked silly, a ball of tangled feathers and straw, but her voice was beyond ferocious. The weasel got up immediately. He approached her, growling, his eyes glinting with rage. Sprout faced him defiantly. The weasel was so thin. Sprout almost felt bad for him. How long had he been starving? He didn't look like the hunter he once was, who moved like the wind. Then she glimpsed his distended stomach and nipples.
Oh!
Sprout was stunned. In the depths of winter, she'd wondered how the weasel's belly had grown so round, and why he'd been so slow. But now she understood. The four-legged babies whining in hunger in the hidden cave. The weasel was their mother. The mallards were about to land. One duck landed first. Sprout saw the cord around his foot. Greentop.
You annoying hen! Get lost!
The weasel bared her teeth. Sprout had to distract her somehow. She took a step back and warned,
Watch out! I'm going to your babies.
and she sprinted toward the willow tree. Realizing after a moment what was going on, the weasel dashed after her. Sprout ran back. Sprout ran with her beak clenched. No matter how weak the weasel was, she was still an excellent hunter. Sprout was nearly nabbed by the neck, but got to the cave under the willow tree first. With her claws, she grabbed the babies that were huddled together. They were mere chunks of flesh, still furless. Sprout really didn't want to do this. It wasn't right, but there was no other way. With her single eye, the weasel looked pleadingly at Sprout. They stared at each other until their breathing calmed. The babies wailed at Sprout's feet. The weasel's expression crumpled pathetically at their cries.
Please, be merciful,
the weasel pleaded, her voice trembling.
They haven't even opened their eyes yet.
Sprout shook her head.
You could have been merciful many times, but you weren't. Not to the white duck, not to Straggler, not to me or my baby. You had many chances, but you never were.
I couldn't help it. You just happened to be around when I was hungry. I did it so I wouldn't starve.
We just happened to be around. No, you couldn't wait to eat us up. Now I'll hurt your precious babies. That's only fair.
No, that's not fair. You're not hungry. I hunt only when I'm hungry, to survive.
I've spent my entire life running away from you. You have no idea how exhausted and sad I've been.
I don't believe it, the weasel retorted. You're the luckiest hen alive. I've never been able to catch you. You've done so many things. I'm the exhausted one. I've got blisters on my feet from following you around so much.
Sprout thought for a moment. The weasel wasn't entirely wrong. Sprout had almost died many times, but here she was, still alive. She felt bad for the young babies pressed under her sharp claws. Their soft skin would bleed in an instant. She unclenched her claws gradually so the weasel wouldn't notice.
If you find another source of food, will you leave my baby alone?
Of course.
Promise? If I told you where to find something to eat.
The weasel nodded quickly.
I promise. If there's something else to eat, I won't go near the baby.
I'm old, but my claws and beak are still strong, Sprout warned. You should know that from experience. If you don't keep your promise, your babies might lose an eye just like their mother.
Then she told the weasel about the haystacks in the rice paddies, about the herd of field mice that had fattened up over the winter, fighting every night over their cramped quarters. The weasel's eyes sparkled with joy, but she hesitated to leave the cave, not entirely trusting Sprout.
You go first, then I'll leave too,
Sprout promised. The weasel finally left. Sprout took another look at the babies trembling in cold and in hunger. She felt pity for a fellow mother. A mother who ran through the dark fields. A mother who had to return quickly to her still blind babies, who couldn't survive if she wasn't as swift as the wind. A mother who was a bone-weary, one-eyed hunter. Aloft like a feather. Green shoots sprouted from every place touched by sunlight. Yellow flowers bloomed on the cornelian cherry trees in the back hills. Spring had come. Sprout paced the rim of the reservoir every day, but Greentop never swam over to her. She understood that the lookout couldn't leave the pack, but she had a hard time suppressing her disappointment. It had been ages since they last spoke. The pleasant weather took a sudden turn for the worse. The wind was cold, the sky overcast, threatening snow. Sprout didn't feel well. She was gray and gloomy, just like the weather. Exhausted, after having walked along the reservoir all day, she returned to the slope. These days she returned to the cave on the slope every night so she could watch Greentop. She wanted to slow down in her old age. She knew the weasel was around, but she didn't have the energy to flee. Sprout started to empathize with the weasel. She knew how difficult it was to go through winter with someone to care for. Sprout crouched at the end of the slope and faced down the cold winds. Sometimes a feather would loosen and blow away. The fierce wind gouged her flesh, but she didn't feel like going inside. Overcome with lethargy, she squinted down at the reservoir. She didn't think she'd make it down there the next day. In the afternoon, the brace of mallards became more active. When they surrounded the leaders and quacked loudly that day, they sounded more excited and louder than on any other day. Sprout didn't know they were preparing to leave for the winterlands up north. The wind blew harder. It cut loose from the back hills and roamed widely, raking the dry fields. Leaves flew about and reeds rustled. The mallards flapped their wings as the hungry weasels circled them, looking for an opportunity. The leader of the mallards took off powerfully into the air. The others flew behind him, one by one, in rows. Sprout looked up at them as they circled the reservoir and the back hills. One broke away and flew down toward the slope. Sprout got to her feet.
Greentop, my baby.
Sprout spread her wings to greet him, but instead of landing, he circled briefly around her. Brushing her with his wings, he called, "Mom," as if to say goodbye. The wind carried his voice into the fields. Sprout stood dumbly in the draft he'd created. She realized this was farewell.
He's leaving.
She'd always known this day would come, but she hadn't had enough time to talk to him or to give him a proper goodbye. Greentop took off again and flapped powerfully to catch up to the other ducks, who were far away by now. Sprout released all the many things she had kept in her heart, waiting for the right moment to share with him. But they failed to become a single word. Instead, she could let out only sobs.
My baby is leaving me.
The flock of mallards blanketed the sky and gradually disappeared beyond the mountains in the distance, their sound becoming faint. It was as though some unknowable world on the other side of the sky was drawing them in. Suddenly, everything was too quiet. Sprout couldn't breathe. It hurt every time she tried, as though her heart were being dislodged. She desperately wanted to go with her baby. She wanted to fly alongside the mallards. She feared being left alone. She hated what was happening. At some point, the weasel had approached, but the hunter didn't frighten her as much as the prospect of being alone. Sprout closed her eyes. She'd had a single wish, to sit on an egg and see the birth of a baby. Her wish had come true. She'd had a hard life, but she'd been happy. That was what had sustained her.
Now I want to fly away. I want to go far away like Greentop.
She flapped her wings. Why hadn't she practiced? When even young Greentop started clumsily on his own, she'd never realized that she'd harbored another wish. It was more than a wish. It was something she physically longed for. Sprout stared into the empty sky, feeling terribly lonely. The weasel's eye was boring into her, but Sprout kept squinting and squinting, trying to look to the end of the sky. Snow began to fall. As she watched snowflakes drifting in the wind, a smile spread across her face.
The acacia flowers are falling.
To Sprout, the snow looked just like acacia petals. Wanting to feel the falling petals with her entire being, she spread her wings wide. She wanted to smell them. She felt wonderful. She wasn't cold or lonely anymore. Then a snarl, and everything disappeared. The petals of the acacia flowers, the scent the gentle breeze. In front of Sprout was a starving weasel.
It's you,
Sprout said, looking into the weasel's sunken eye. She thought about those soft babies and their delicate flesh. They were like the last egg she laid, the one with a soft shell that had shattered in the yard. Sprout remembered how her heart had broken, how sad she'd felt. Her body was stiff now. No longer could she run away. She no longer had reason to, nor did she have the energy.
go on, eat me,
She urged.
fill your babies' bellies.
She closed her eyes. Sprout was suffocating. She had imagined it would hurt, but now all she felt was bone-deep relief.
You got me, finally.
Everything turned black. She'd experienced this once before in the fields, when she'd heard the white duck scream. Everything had turned black, and then, very gradually, as now, she'd sensed a reddish hue. Then everything slowly became brighter. Sprout opened her eyes. The sky was a blinding blue. She felt transparent and buoyant, and then, like a feather, she was aloft, gliding through the air with her large, beautiful wings. Sprout looked down at everything below, the reservoir and the fields in a snowstorm, and the weasel limping away, a scrawny hen dangling from her jaws.
Oh.
The end.